Hi, and welcome back to another episode of ADK Talks. I'm Jane, along with my co-host and brother Steve. Say hi, Steve.
Hello.
And we bring you the best of the Adirondacks, whether it's a place to eat, shop, stay, or something to experience. We are your guides to discovering the amazing things to do in New York State's 6 million acre Adirondack Park. Today on ADK Talks, we are joined by Erin Tobin, who is the Executive Director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, or ARCH for short, which is a nonprofit champion of historic preservation across the Adirondacks. From great camps to working class hamlets, ARCH helps tell the stories written in wood, stone, and steel. So, Erin, welcome to ADK Talks.
Welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Jane and Steve. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon. And what a great introduction to Adirondack Architectural Heritage and what we do. That's fantastic. I'm super smiling because that was a great way to put our mission and what we're all about.
Awesome. Yeah, I have been following Arch for a long time. We're going to get into what your mission is, but as I understand it, where I'd like to start, Erin, is with Great Camp Santanoni, which is a really interesting property to me. I'm going to let you tell the story about it a little bit, but for those who haven't visited, what do you think makes it such an iconic place in the Adirondacks?
Yes. Well, it is the only publicly owned Great Camp that is open to the public for visitation, that is within the Adirondack Forest Preserve. So it is iconic Adirondacks. It is a piece of iconic Adirondack architecture within the wilderness, within the Forest Preserve. So when you go into it, you're walking on a 4.5-mile carriage road or riding a bicycle or taking a horse-drawn wagon, and you arrive and you're in the woods on a lake that's surrounded by woods and loons and silence other than the sounds of nature. And that's a very specific Adirondack type experience.
Yeah.
At Camp Santanoni, you see the architecture of the Adirondacks reflected in its building. So, it blends in with the built environment and reflects the logs. It's built with the logs surrounding the Great Camp, the stones surrounding the Great Camp.
Now, the original owners, the people who built Santanoni, Robert Prine, I know is from the Albany area. He was a well-to-do banker there. His father, as I understand it, though, was ambassador to Japan, and there's sort of that Asian Japan influence in the architecture style. So when I think of Great Camp, I immediately think of William West Durant and that Sagamore and that sort of iconic architecture, which I think there is some influence of that here, but in Santanoni. But I was really fascinated by sort of the Japanese influence.
Yes. And that sets it apart, contrasted, for example, with Great Camp Sagamore, which was fancier, has this almost Swiss chalet type influence, along with things like a bowling alley and separate playroom. At Santanoni, you were supposed to be outside, and it has these influences of that Japanese architecture that Robert Prine was exposed to as a young boy when he went over to Japan with his father. One of the things we often point out is the iramoya roof, which is a type of East Asian roof design that combines a hipped roof with a gable. And that's a good reflection. That's a Japanese style roof reflected in that you see in some of the palaces in Japan. And what distinguishes this as an Adirondack iramoya roof is the open log screening in the gable and the use of the peeled logs to frame the roof. And those peeled logs create a lightness and a heightened sense of the space on the porch. So that's something you might find, for example, the log design is emblematic of other types of great camps. William Coulter comes to mind over at Eagle Island, but at Santanoni, it's a double height roof without a projecting balcony. The bark is peeled off of the log, so you've got that lightness. You don't see the kind of detailed twig design. The architect really employed full logs in the geometric patterns there.
And a lot of the buildings were connected by walkways, right? Or covered walkways.
Yes. And so not exclusive. So at some great camps, and what really one of the defining characteristics of the quote great Adirondack camp, the great camp, is that you had separate functions in different buildings. So you had your sleeping buildings, you had your kitchen building, and dining in a separate building, a living room space. That is reflected as well at Santanoni, where you've got your living room, dining room, library in one building, kitchen in another, sleeping quarters outside of that, arranged in a design that from above looks like a bird in flight, and connected by a series of porches, one long porch, 5,000 square feet of porch, in fact, that overlook Newcomb Lake. Other great camps have those connecting porches and walkways with roof coverings. Again, you'll find that on several William Coulter camps, among others, but not necessarily connecting all of the sleeping quarters in quite the same way. And Santanoni's porch really flows into itself. So it's just one long connecting porch, not so much a series of connecting walkways.
Got it. It's a really striking property. The Prines, given that they were in Albany, did they visit Santanoni frequently, or more frequently, than, a JP Morgan who had to come all the way from New York, which was back in the late 1800s, was like a 36-hour journey.
Yes, it was still quite a journey for the Prines, but they did come up quite frequently. And in fact, the first spring party, the building was still somewhat under construction. They were so eager to get up there. And we have a wonderful record of the gatherings at Santanoni through one of the cousins of the Prine family. Hiberti Prine had kept a journal. And we know so much about Santanoni through her writings in her journal, which is a real treasure and very helpful to us in interpreting and understanding the space.
Did they come in the winter?
They did come in the winter. We have photographs of them in the winter harvesting ice out on the lake, but I don't think they came very frequently.
Okay. I always think that would be like the most romantic time to, come up here, with the snow. But I'm thinking of how we travel in the winter. I don't know that I would want to be
four-wheel drive and heated automobiles. I don't know how.
Well, I can say having done, so of course we have winter weekends at Santanoni 3 times a year where people can come in. And I've stayed out there just this past February during the big snowstorm. And I was out on the lake getting water for washing, probably similar to what they would have had to do. And I was thinking about the Prines. It's a lot of work.
Aaron, speaking of life up there, not just speaking of the wintertime, but one of the things on my first visit up there, I was really amazed by wasn't just the great camp itself, but the outbuildings, the whole farm area. When I first went up, that big barn was still there before it had been lost. And I wonder if you talked about the preservation of those additional buildings that some people might not necessarily think of, but it's really after the gatehouse, it's the first thing you see is about a mile in there. All of a sudden, you think you're at this little village.
Yes. Yeah. And you're coming in and you're coming up a little hill, and then there's a flat clearing. And so you're in the woods for a mile. And then all of a sudden, that's a great way to put it. It's like you're in a little village. So the farm complex began after the main camp out at Newcomb Lake was constructed. So the main camp that we were just discussing, 1892 to 1893. Then, with that finished, Robert Prine continues to acquire land, working backwards towards the Newcomb Hamlet along Newcomb Lake Road, which is the carriage path. He works with Edward Burnett. Edward Burnett was a gentleman's farm designer. He was a well-known farm designer who worked on Shelburne Farms in Vermont, who's from Boston. And Robert was really interested in farming and in dairy production, in having self-sufficiency for Camp Santanoni. And that's actually a hallmark of many of these large Adirondack camps, is the idea of self-sufficiency. You'll see that at Great Camp Sagamore as well. And so he built this farm working with Edward Burnett, and there's a variety of types of architecture at the farm. There's a creamery building, which is the same era as the artist studio and the gate lodge at the front of the camp, the artist studio back at the main camp, both signed by Delano and Aldrich. And then you'll see the creamery is this stone building where they had a whole dairy operation, and dairy was a big deal back then to have safe dairy to eat. They had a stone smokehouse where they smoked their own bacon and their meats, and had quite a large operation. When you go there now, so there was the barn that tragically burned 21 years ago. But if you walk down to where the barn ruins are, you can still see a lot of what the barn was. And I find that quite fascinating. And then if you go up into the gardener's cottage next to the dairy, there's wonderful models of what the farm was in one room and another model of the barn. And so you can look at the model of the barn, and then you can cross the street and walk down the hill and look at the ruins of the barn and kind of understand what that structure might have looked like. Now, I never saw it. I unfortunately never went into Santanoni until after the fire. And I can only imagine the sense of loss, knowing how large and striking it was in the landscape of the barn. But I also think what is left can be interpreted. And those models done by an artist named Tim Sauter are just really fantastic as a way of understanding.
That's amazing. So they must have had people year round to take care of the animals and the property.
Yes, their families lived there. One family we know were the Petoffs. They lived in the gardener's cottage. The gardener's cottage is the building where the models are. And we have met through the years, representatives of Arch have met with different members of that family as they've come through. Actually, just last week, one of our summer interns was saying that I think a family member of one of the Santanoni staff, a descendant, came into the main camp. So sometimes we just meet people, which is really wonderful, with
That's
a connection
so
to the
cool.
site. Yeah.
That's so cool.
As I recall, the Prynes actually get dairy products, and were items shipped down from when they were living in Albany, from the farm. Just for some reason I remember that being
I don't have that same memory. That wouldn't surprise me. That's not something we typically say, so I'm not 100% sure. I know that the community got a lot of dairy products from Santanoni,
okay.
So they would share with the surrounding Newcomb community. I'm not sure that they would necessarily transport the farm products down to Albany. I'd imagine maybe they did, but what I do know is that they gave, the community not took advantage of, but benefited from the farm in many ways.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, do you know what the origin is of the name Santanoni?
That's a common question. So my understanding is that the mountain was named first. And of course, you can see the mountain from the Great Camp. There's no clarity on the origin of the name Santanoni. There are multiple stories and speculations about where it comes from, but we don't have any clear answer.
So this is usually the part in the podcast where Stephen asked me to ask you for the URL for Great Camp Santanoni. So I'm happy that I beat him to it.
Well, perhaps you should also do for Arch as well, but we'll save that for later.
We'll save that for I'll save that for you to have as a treat later. So listener, if you want to see, Santanoni has its own website with great pictures if you want to see what we're talking about. And that's at Great Camp Santanoni, SANTANONI.com. So
Yes.
Take a look. And you can also find out when you're there, all the information about visiting it, when they have tours, how to get in and out. And then, they're open in the summer. Well, you should be, I don't want to tell you your business, Erin, but you're open all summer long and then into the fall. And then you have occasional winter weekends. I believe you have like 3 or 4 winter weekends, I think.
Yes.
Where people can snowshoe, cross-country ski, and does the covered wagon, or it's not a covered wagon, it's the horse-drawn wagon, does that take people in the winter?
It does not. The road is not
plowed or it's not known.
That
Be tough for a
would not
horse.
make it conducive for skiing or snowshoeing either. But they can definitely take the horse-drawn wagon in during the summer, and that's through Newcomb Farms. And I want to make sure people know that they can call Larry Newcomb to take the wagon in and make a reservation. And then in the winter, because it's public, it's always open.
Oh,
In terms of being able to ski or snowshoe out there. But in the winter, the buildings won't be open except for those 3 winter weekends a year: Martin Luther King Day weekend, President's Day weekend, and typically the weekend around St. Patrick's Day. Those are the 3 weekends that we traditionally have the artist studio open at the end of that 5-mile ski or snowshoe with hot chocolate and coffee and tea, and you can take a tour and warm up.
that's very cool. That's very cool. What were the Prines like? Well, obviously they were wealthy. What's sort of their, we when we had Great Camp Sagamore on, Connor Williams, the historian, really talked a little bit about Margaret Emerson's personality and the personalities of the family. What were the Prines like?
From what we know, Anna was really the one who was excited to be in nature. And I think of her as, if you were staying out at the main camp as her guest, she would be the one ringing the bell or asking a staff member to ring the bell early in the morning and telling you to get outside and get on a guide boat and, boat across the lake, go fishing, go hiking, be outdoors. When I think about the fact, for example, that there is not a bowling alley or any of these indoor amenities, she was all about being outside and spending time on the porch and spending time outside. And so I feel a lot of her, energy at the main camp. That was what she wanted, was to be in nature. And Robert too, but Robert was really all about the farm. And I think of him as being maybe more of a problem solver. How do we get fresh, safe dairy and, provide meat for our guests? And, what's the latest technology that I can employ in order to do those things?
And did their heirs continue on with a legacy, or what sort of, how did it come into different hands in the mid 20th century?
So after they passed away, their children had the camp and they built the artist studio for Ned, their oldest. Their daughter Ruth had a gazebo out at the main camp. But, their children did kind of scatter a bit. Their son, known as Fritz, spent a lot of time at the Gate Lodge. And, as these things happen, it was into a family trust. Resources became stretched a little bit thin. And then that's at the point that the Melvins came in the mid 20th century, in the early 1950s. And I credit the Melvins for making improvements to the site, maintaining the buildings. I mean, the Melvins acquired this almost 13,000 acre parcel with these 3 different building complexes that had been in the family trust, and they made sure those buildings were kept up. And they spent a lot of time there. They spent a lot of time at the Gate Lodge. We know from talking to members of the family that they spent time at the main camp, but also at the Gate Lodge, and made some of those kind of deferred maintenance type repairs that were really important. Because after the Melvins entered into a conversation with the Nature Conservancy and New York State in the early 70s, as many large private landowners did when the APA was created, turning these large land holdings over to the state. And then the state didn't really know what to do with it, because with the Forever Wild clause, they didn't want any of the buildings that Santanoni contained. And the fact that the buildings just kind of sat there for almost 20 years and didn't fall into greater disrepair, I think is because of the Melvin stewardship. in the mid 20th century, and the quality of craftsmanship, of course, and the quality of the building materials.
Was there ever electricity there? Did they have running water?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, there
Interesting.
was a generator. So there's outlets, there's light fixtures, there's plumbing. The sinks and the bathtubs and the toilets are all still there. There's the pump house that pumped the water up from the lake is still there at the lake. We know they had a septic system, and we know where that septic system leach field and tank was. Of course, all of that went away after the state acquired it, and we operate it. It's in a historic area. It's land classified as historic within the forest preserve, but we have a kind of a wild forest ethic of how we maintain the site. So, certainly we'll never have electricity or running water there. It's part of the wild forest. When you're out there, you're in the forest.
Right.
There are privies, and the buildings, like I said, are allowed to remain there because of this historic land use classification, which was created to save Santanoni and has since been used for the Adirondack fire towers. It's also the land use classification for Crown Point Historic Site and John Brown's farm.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah, I remember the whole debate. There were actually a lot of people that wanted the buildings burned down.
Oh, yes.
Completely converted to Forever Wild. And it was I think it was when I was in college, and I had a roommate who was sort of leaned that way. And we had some heated debates as to this architectural gem there should be a special exemption made for that. And he was of no, it's got to be completely destroyed and allowed to return. I'm sure there are people that still feel that.
Let's kind of put an underscore around that for listeners who might not be aware. So half of the land in the Adirondacks, maybe a little under half, is owned by the state, is part of the state park, is deemed to be forever wild. And what that means is if you give the land over to the state and it's returned back to the wild, you have to remove any man-made buildings or anything that man put on that land to return it back to its original state. So I was just at the Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake, which used to be known as the Museum on Blue Mountain Lake. I brought some friends there from Kansas City. It's a great place. If you really want to understand the Adirondacks better, I go like 3 times a year at least. But they have I believe it's called the Buck Club. It's an old hunter's lodge that the people gave the land to the state, but they moved the lodge itself. They took it apart log by log and rebuilt it at the museum. So when people talk about wanting to burn things down, they're not pyromaniacs. They're advocating for the land to be returned to its natural state. Did I get that right, Aaron? Correct me if I'm wrong, please.
That was perfect. That was perfect. And we believe that in the case of special places like Santanoni, like the fire towers, by the buildings remaining within the wilderness, it's a both and situation. They complement each other. They help tell each other's stories. They make the other a little bit more special. You have a different experience, Newcomb Lake, when you're on the porch at Santanoni. And just like you have a different experience coming upon the buildings when you're coming out of the woods. So it allows for this specific kind of experience. And for me and Santanoni, what I often think about is the democratization of that space. So I said how Robert Prine bought all this land, he privatized what was a public road, and now it's public again. And this was a camp that Teddy Roosevelt went to, that the elite of Albany and Eastern New York would come and visit by invitation. And now it's open for anybody 365 days a year. You can, if you can get yourself out there, you can sit on that porch and you can experience that kind of magic of shelter and architecture and wilderness.
That's such a great history of Santanoni. Thank you so much for that. So let's zoom out now. And for those people who might not know who Arch is, how would you describe your mission and what your day-to-day work is today? So Arch played a pivotal role, and I think, were you founded as part of the preserving of Santanoni, or was Arch already in place and Santanoni just became a big project for Arch?
We're founded in large part to save Camp Santanoni, and also was kind of this example of the need for a preservation organization in the Adirondacks. So we were founded in 1990, a meeting in the Thousand Islands where there was a discussion specific to the need for a preservation group in the Adirondacks, in large part because of Camp Santanoni.
Interesting.
But that wasn't the exclusive reason for our founding, and our board was not exclusively focused on Santanoni, but certainly had that as a key pillar of who we are, as it remains a key pillar of who we are. Our mission, though, is broader, and it's to promote the better public understanding, appreciation, and stewardship of the unique and diverse architectural heritage of the Adirondacks. And we cover the entire 6 million acre Adirondack Park. Wow. And also all of the counties that have land that is part of the park. So we go to the Canadian border, we go to the Vermont border in Washington County. We have events in Lewis County, out west in the Tug Hill, and sometimes even go a bit beyond. We had a tour in Oneida County, which has just a little teeny piece in the park, and we'll do programs in the Thousand Islands. So we look to achieve our mission through partnership and collaboration in education and action and advocacy. We have educational tours and programs. We do hands-on technical workshops. We support advocacy efforts, working with communities and individuals who want to preserve their buildings. We offer technical assistance. We do some fee-for-service work. So if you want to engage us to do a survey of the history of your community. We're working in Ausable Forks right now. Our preservation services director is doing a National Register cultural resources survey for the hamlet of Ausable Forks, looking at its architecture.
Well, that's so interesting. And what I think is also cool, when I've been on your website, the things that you're looking to preserve and feature and highlight, they really run the gamut. I mean, it's residential places, it's industrial places, it's, artist studios. I think I saw one summer you guys were doing a mid-century modern tour. It really runs the gamut. It's incredible. In fact, the way that you and I connected, Steve, the way that Erin and I connected was after we talked to the folks at Northwood Cabins and in Tupper Lake and what they did to restore that iconic, motor court there. So how do you stay expert on all these different, genres or types of places? Like, that seems a little bit like boiling the ocean to me. How does that work?
Well, we have a wonderful staff team. We have a 6-person staff team, and they're fantastic and so curious, so smart, so engaged. And it's really fun, speaking for myself, and hopefully our team agrees. It's really fun to learn about these things. It's fascinating to learn more about Arto Monaco and Santa's workshop, for example.
Right.
I know we talked a bit the missile silos and the region's Cold War history. You don't think about missile silos when you think about the Adirondacks.
Nope.
But we have an entire Cold War history surrounding, in the radius surrounding Plattsburgh and the Air Force Base. So there's so many stories. And, I think it's keeping the intellectual curiosity, the feeling that, we have I don't want to say responsibility, but a privilege to share the stories of our region as reflected in the built environment. And that is, I think, in a nutshell, what it is. It's the history of the region and the stories of the people how it's reflected in the built environment, which makes us an architectural preservation group, not just a historical society. Not that there's any just about a historical society.
That's so interesting. I love that, because one of the things, I mean, even, on our first podcast episode that we talk about is, the Adirondacks aren't for just one thing or one person.
Mm-hmm.
You can hike, you can paddle, you can ski, you can visit a gallery, you can visit an historic place, you can snowmobile, you can, as long as people are respecting the land and the environment and, the principles of the park, it's 6 million acres. There's something here for everyone. And I love that approach to how you guys are thinking about it. I'm sure Steve is chomping at the bit to ask you a question about the missile silos, because he always talks about wanting to buy one. So, Steve, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let you find out if you have anything you want to ask Aaron about the missile silos.
No, I've read up on them over the years, and I guess this would be a question. Have any of them been preserved for people to look at, or are they all privately owned still?
They're privately owned. We held a tour at one of the sites in Lewis 2 years ago. Some of them remain sensitive depending on the type of ownership. So there's always a lot of interest in them. And as far as I know, they're not threatened in any way. I don't know that they're going to go anywhere. It would be fairly complicated to
Sure.
to do anything with them. I think they're going to be around for quite some time. But I do hope that we can bring people to one of the missile silos again in the not too distant future.
Oh,
why were they placed here?
And there's some in Vermont too. It's a radius surrounding Plattsburgh and the Air Force Base. And if you look at a dozen installations, I'm just looking at, there's an Adirondack Life article about it, but in the early 60s, they were placed basically in a ring around Plattsburgh Air Force Base. So there's some that's in the park, but then of course there's some that are north of Plattsburgh, and then in Vermont on the other side of Lake Champlain.
But it was because geographically we were closer to Russia? I mean, why here? Why not
Plattsburgh was a SAC base, so Strategic Air Command base that
Yes.
had in the 60s B-52s and refuelers, and then when I was at Plattsburgh in early to mid 80s, it was FB-111s. They were considered to be the first strike until the nuclear subs sort of took over that role. They were the first strike in the event of a missile attack. Retaliatory.
Thank you, Steve. You got it.
As a matter of fact, when I was in college, the phone book had a section of it that with detailed instructions on how to evacuate in the event of a missile attack.
Aaron, I told you he was going to dig
the people that
on the missile silos. He pretended like he didn't have any questions, but we gave him a platform. What do you wish people understood better about historic preservation, or what do you think is the biggest misperception?
I don't know about biggest, but there's one of the misperceptions that we in some ways are responsible for, and this gets into one of the things I was going to say is, in thinking about telling people stories, one thing that we seek to do is to tell a complete history of the park. And the park has history of institutionalization, history of being a place of imprisonment, history of maybe not being such a welcoming place to everybody, to all races, to all ethnicities. And we want to create welcoming spaces and tell an honest history of the park. And sometimes there are misconceptions about historic preservation where, it's only about the great camps. It's only about the wealthy history. Why do you care about the vernacular buildings on Main Street in Ausable Forks? In some ways, our movement was founded to preserve the houses of the famous, mostly white men, but that's something that we as a field, have grown more intentional about, have a lot of work to do, but to make it clear that we want to preserve a complete history and do it in a way that honors all traditions and all approaches.
I like that. I think that's
Hmm.
really good. I think people think a lot of times it's about the pretty stuff, the George Washington slept here kind of places. And I think I love how you put that about telling the complete story. I think that's really great. I don't know what the vernacular buildings are in Osable Forks. What is that? I've never heard that phrase before, that term.
Well, that's just the main street of Sable Forks. That's
Okay.
going to 20 Main and the cement block structure. So vernacular is, maybe that's what's it called? Like a $20 word or something.
Yeah.
But those are just the everyday buildings,
Okay.
typically not architect designed. The houses that are built for workers. The best way to put it is that it's a building that isn't necessarily designed by an architect, that it's your standards. Maybe it's the kit building,
Right.
or the one that's sort of built by the carpenters without any particular design, but also still have a design and still have a lot of craftsmanship associated with them.
Do you think that there's something about the Adirondacks architecture or Adirondack architecture? We talked about there's lots of different styles, but that helps this region stand out among the other parts of New York State? Is there something about just the places that are here that people come to see that are, I don't know, different from the Catskills or different from the western part of New York State? You mentioned the Thousand Islands or, Long Island or other parts of our state.
The Adirondack rustic, which is exemplified by the Great Camps, but also by the, smaller log cabins, log construction, is kind of stands apart. And while other regions of the country, in many ways, kind of followed the Adirondacks' lead
Interesting.
in that rustic style. So, if you look at a lot of the National Park Service buildings, and today over the weekend, we
Yeah.
heard that the lodge at Grand Canyon National Park burned. And
Oh
if you looked
no.
at an interior photo of that lodge on the North Rim, that was a historic building, I think from the 1930s, you would
Yeah.
think, oh, that must be in the Adirondacks. But it was here first. So, and that's a style that carries through all types of buildings, whether it's kind of a fishing camp, a 2-room fishing camp on a river, to Santanoni, using local materials, native materials, logs from surrounding the building, the stones from surrounding the building. That's a very specific Adirondack characteristic. And one thing that I think is really neat, and I'm sitting here in Keene, and there's a house around the corner that has this, but and I'm thinking of another house in Newcomb, the idea of this decorative work with twigs and branches, and you'll see it on fences along people's properties. And it's all types of houses. Again, this isn't just the great camps. This is all the house, many types of houses using this decorative work of the materials that are found in nature. And that's not something you necessarily see in other regions.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. And that sort of that rustic furniture. And again, the Adirondack experience has an amazing collection, and that's a great place to see it up close if you haven't seen it. We talked about Santanoni a lot. Is there another preservation success story that you think is just a very remarkable, or something else you want to point out? Anything in particular?
Yes, there's a couple. And I would say one that comes to mind, and this is another forest preserve success story, but it's the Adirondack fire towers. And one time there were about 57 in the Adirondacks, and now there's, I think, about 34 remaining. We've long been advocates for preserving the fire towers in the Adirondacks. There is a question of what to do with them when they're in the forest preserve, like hurricane Mountain Fire Tower is a great example. And now they are preserved through this historic land use classification. But I think it's a great example of coalition building, of people bringing their different strengths to the table, grassroots organizing. We were there from the preservation perspective, talking about the structural and architectural significance of the fire towers, because they do have I say structural, but there is an architecture to the fire towers.
Mm-hmm.
And now they are so celebrated. And there's the Fire Tower Challenge and great work that the Adirondack Mountain Club does to promote fire tower hikes and the lighting of the towers at the beginning of September. And so that's a great example of something that many people wanted to be taken out of the landscape, now celebrated as being a really important part of our landscape.
Yeah. For listeners, for our listener in Frankfurt, Germany, a fire tower is I don't know, how many stories would you say a fire tower is? 10?
They can vary. So the one at the Adirondack Museum at the Adirondack Experience is quite short. And then some are quite tall. So they can range from 2 or 3 stories to 5, 6, 7, 8 stories.
It was like a little one-room cabin. They're metal mostly. But it's like a one-room cabin on top of these stairs. And the rangers they were at the top of tall mountains, and that's how they looked out for fires and wildfires. And that was their detection system, back in the day. And I'm really glad you mentioned, and we'll put links to this in our show notes for any listeners that are interested. There's a fire tower challenge, sort of like climbing the 46 high peaks. You have to climb a certain number of fire towers, and I think you get a patch or something when you're done. And then in usually Labor Day weekend or early in September, they light them up. Not all of them, but many of them. And it's really incredible to see. It's a really, really, I think, cool tradition. I think there's Owl's Head has a fire tower. Does Poco Moonshine?
Yep.
Yes.
Did. It still is.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they're I forget, Erin, how many you said are still, you can't climb all of them. But there's, I don't know, 20 some odd that you can, or more than that.
Somewhere around there. I don't have a list of exactly how many you can climb. I know there's somewhere around 34 that are remaining. Some still need repair, so that's why you can't climb them. Some are being repaired. I believe Goodnoe Mountain Fire Tower, which is not part of the Forest Preserve. It's owned by ESF, but that's being repaired right now. And Poco Moonshine, that's within the Forest Preserve. Yes, so you can climb them, and there's different levels of hiking to access them. So some are quite short and some are quite long, and really there's something for everyone.
Yeah. And one of the best times to go is some of them, it can be accessed in the winter. And so it's a really great way to see the park in a different season. Erin, one of the things that I think is so great is that you guys not only do all this work to preserve these places and pay attention to these important sites, but you also take people there. Can you talk a little bit about your tours and some of your special programs?
Sure. So we run 35 to 40 educational tours, hands-on technical workshop. We have webinars often in the winter months, but our tour programs, one of the things we're sometimes best known for, and it's all about bringing people to the places that tell the story of our Adirondack and North Country history. And that has really multiple benefits. It's a way of connecting to communities, sharing the history of a community and what makes that place special with people who might not be from there. I'll use as an example, we were in Boonville last week talking about Boonville's extraordinary history, Boonville on Route 12 in Oneida County on the Black River Canal. And sometimes some people I said, they were like, why are you going to Boonville? You don't think about, it's not Great Camp Sagamore, but Boonville has an amazing history, an amazing collection of architecture. And that's just a great example of part of our mission of why we run these tour programs. It's not really entertainment. It's about sharing the history and bringing people together and highlighting the excellent work of so many great other nonprofits in communities.
That's amazing. Listener, we will include a link to their events page. The tours are amazing, but you need to act fast because they sell out really quickly, and they're very fascinating. And I know Boonville. I used to go to summer camp actually outside of Lowville, and the Western Adirondacks look a lot different from other parts of the Adirondacks too. So it's an interesting place to visit.
Yes.
Was there ever a tour or program that really surprised or moved you, or the participants where they maybe walked away seeing something in a completely different light?
That's a wonderful question. I'm really moved after every tour.
Wow.
And that might seem like an easy out type of answer, but it's really true. Every tour, I'm struck by the remarkable history and of each place and what makes that place special and itself, that sense and power of place, which is why I'm in this field in the first place. So, it'd be hard to pick one in particular, but I will say I am also always honored, amazed, feel a deep sense of privilege for connecting to the people who tell their stories as part of our tours. And we have this wonderful community of tour leaders and individuals who open up their camps, open up their houses, their businesses, their nonprofits to share what they're all about, whether it's a camp that a couple spent years restoring and spending time with their family, or the Seagull Music Festival over in Scroon Lake.
Yeah, we just had them on the podcast. Yes.
I noticed that. So, and we've been there. So there's so much. And this region has, just the best, deepest, most interesting history. And I'm going to, I try not to be superlative about it, but I will. It really, it's pretty great.
Yeah. I lived in New York City for many years and moved up here full time last year. And I still get surprised by stuff. I'm like, I can't believe this is here. Like the Seagull Festival is a great example of that. The caliber of the young performers that they bring. These are people who are in Juilliard and top schools that go on to perform at the Met and, top opera places. I'm getting off on a tangent. Wow. That is pretty amazing. I don't think we've ever gone this far, Steve, without a tangent. So
Meadowmount. We haven't even talked about Meadowmount.
What's Meadowmount?
Oh my goodness. Well, this would be a bit of a tangent. The Meadowmount music program in the summer, which is an intensive training program for string musicians.
Wow. Where's that? See, there's so much to uncover here.
So the Meadowmount School of Music is in Westport.
Okay.
And they have had an extraordinary faculty with very famous musicians for more than 80 years. And they offer performances throughout their summer season. It's like a music camp.
Okay.
And they have performances. They'll be at Ballard Park in Westport sometime soon. They offer performances that I think you pay to go see at their campus in Westport. The music school grounds have their own interesting history because the main building was the home of Inez Milholland, who was a suffragist and a really important American suffragist and peace advocate and lawyer. So
okay,
Meadowmount has a remarkable history.
Put that on the list.
Yes, I'm so excited that I shared something new.
Oh, listen, you probably have lots that I don't know, so don't worry about it. And I'm just going to go off on a teeny tiny tangent about listener. Westport is in Essex County, the northeastern part of the Adirondacks on Lake Champlain. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's up and coming, but there's a lot going on there right now. And the Depot Theater, which is the only actors equity performing group in the Adirondacks, puts on amazing plays during the summer. And it's in an old and actually still operating train station, which gives it a whole nother, twist to it. But, all of the stuff that you're doing, though, right, Erin, costs money. So I know that many people may not be aware of this, but I know that probably a significant portion of your work relies on state and federal funding. And as we know right now, it's a pretty challenging time for a lot of organizations. How are you guys rethinking or thinking about your funding? What's really critical to you, and how can people support you?
Thank you. Yes, it is a time that people are making a lot of contingency plans surrounding government funds at Arch. In one sense, we're very lucky because a relatively small percentage of our operating budget comes from federal grant, and that's a grant we received from the National Park Service in 2022 to create a re-grant program called the Adirondack Rural Revitalization Program. And we were able to make grants to 10 places throughout our service region to help them invest in their historic buildings, municipalities, nonprofits, farm owners. We were able to give them grants through this National Park Service funding so that they could invest in their place. And we're lucky that that funding remains with us. The percentage of federal money that's in our operating budget comes from that federal grant that we received 3 years ago that we're just wrapping up, where the current federal situation impacts in one sense is that we don't expect that this program will continue. This was a program specifically to help rural communities with historic preservation. And we had hoped to reapply, and we had hoped that we could keep this program going because there is a 2-to-1, almost a 3-to-1 applicant to availability demand. We could fund 2 or 3 times as many projects as we're able to. And I hope that we can find some other source of funding to continue a preservation grant program in some fashion. Surely not as generously funded as we received from the federal government, but we would love to find something. On the state side, we're lucky to live in New York State. We have concerns about, what the state budget, how the state budget will have to react to federal money being pulled from Medicaid and other important health initiatives, education,
libraries.
So, buildings are important. Buildings house people. They provide shelter to people, but human life is paramount. Sure. And when choosing between, keeping schools and hospitals open or being able to restore a historic building, it's pretty clear where the priorities will be and really where they should be. But we hope that we can continue doing the important work we do because we are also a piece of a community and of community economic development and of shelter and of joy and quality of life and keeping that history alive.
Yep, exactly right. Mm-hmm. And you're not saying it, so I will. You can go on Arch's website, which is aarch.org, and you'll see all different ways you can support them financially if you're moved by what Erin says and should be moved by it. So, let's just hope that things get better.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. The question you've been dreading that we can't wait to ask, as we ask every guest, and we let our guests know ahead of time because they have to think about it. But we ask our folks, our guests on our show who are mostly native to the Adirondacks. Every now and then we have somebody who's in Albany or in another place. What is their favorite hidden gem, or maybe even not so hidden gem in the Adirondacks? And I'm sorry you can't say any Arch projects, But what's there? You're the place where you take people from out of town, or when people say, where should I really visit? What do you tell them? And it can be anything from a great place to eat or have a beer to the Racket Lake Navigation Company to a hike or a paddle. The Seagull Festival you've already mentioned too. But what's something that you think is really special and you love to visit in the Adirondacks?
This is a project that it's an advocacy project, but it's
Okay.
not one of ours. I mean, it is our advocacy, but it's part of the Forest Preserve. And it's DeBar Pond, I will say. And we have been active in advocating for the preservation of DeBar Pond Lodge, which is a 1940 Adirondack camp designed by William Diston on DeBar Pond. And DeBar Pond, it's tucked out of the way. It's in Franklin County, well north of Saranac Lake. But one of the great things about DeBar Pond, and there's DeBar Mountain that overlooks the pond, and then the lodge, is that you can drive down a dirt road where you might want to have a car with some clearance, but the parking to access the pond is only maybe a quarter mile from the pond itself. So the DEC parking lot, and you're in the Forest Preserve, is where the trailhead is. You don't have very far to walk. This is not 5 miles into the main camp at Santanoni, for example. And so that makes it much more accessible. And yet when you get to DeBar Pond, I think I've said magic now 3 times, but I'll say it again. The way that the mountains that surround the pond fall into the pond, this isn't an original idea, that it's fjord-like. It has that feeling that you see in pictures of Scandinavia. It sits in the landscape, the way that the mountains come down to the pond. Almost all the spots in the Adirondacks are like no other, but it's unique. And we've been hoping that the state would preserve DeBar Pond Lodge, which is in the Forest Preserve. There's many who would like to see it removed because it violates the Forever Wild clause. So like your conversation, Steve, in college, it still is happening even today. The Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State is trying to decide what to do. Their mission is not historic preservation. We have said we will do whatever we can to support them. Just like at Camp Santanoni, we do private fundraising. We bring interns in. We have workforce training programs at Santanoni. We bring those resources and our, rolling up our sleeves to preserve DeBar Pond Lodge. But there are many people who wish to see it fully taken away and the pond completely going back to wilderness. There's a 6-acre area when you go there that's mowed, so there is a mowed path to the water, which again makes it accessible. And that's one of the special qualities of it. And that makes it a good place to take visitors. You could go there and have a picnic. It'd be a really quick portage to take your canoe or kayak and then paddle out on the pond. When you're paddling out on the pond, the lodge itself disappears within the trees. And again, you're surrounded by Forest Preserve, and that's pretty special.
That sounds amazing. We got to put that on the list. That sounds really, really cool. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing everything you've shared with us today, Aaron. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and love the work you're doing. And, thank you for all that you do here in the Adirondacks, you and Arch. And
thank you.
We got to have you back on again, I think, because there's a lot of stuff we didn't even get to. So we'll get working on that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on the podcast for this really fun conversation. I love getting to talk about Arch and the Adirondacks and what we do. And thank you for all of your interest. And it was great to meet you over Zoom.
Yeah. Great.
Awesome.
What a great guest. That was so much fun.
Yeah, it was awesome. We barely got halfway through what we thought we'd go through. So.
I know. I had a feeling that I was too ambitious with our topic list, but She was so knowledgeable and so interesting and passionate. I love to see when people are really passionate about something, whether it's, one of our earliest guests from Custard's Last Stand and his passion for, his family business, or, somebody like Erin, to Yvonne from On the Equator Hot Tubs. And, she was passionate about a sauna, not on the Equator saunas, not hot tubs. It's just really, I think that's really the hallmark of these institutions and businesses in the Adirondacks. The people behind them are very passionate about what they do. And I think that makes it unique.
I have to agree.
Okay. Well, listener, thank you again for tuning in to ADK Talks. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. It does really matter. It helps others discover not only our show, but also how to find the best things in the Adirondack Park. And if you are looking for more exclusive Adirondack content and local insights, visit adktaste.com and be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter just once a week. It ensures that you never miss an update. So until next time, keep exploring the fabulous 6 million acre Adirondack Park.
Enjoy. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Steve Areno, take care. Goodbye.
Take care. Good night, Frankfurt.
Good night, Frankfurt. Bye-bye.